Thank you very much, Saburi-san. Good morning, everyone. I'm missing Tokyo. I'm missing Rieti. Um, so the topic today is Build Back Better, question mark, the future of U.S.-China economic relations. So rather than talking narrowly about a single research paper, I thought I will discuss broadly about some thoughts on this topic and very much welcome hearing feedback from colleagues in reality. So I want to speak broadly about three related subjects. Number one, assessing the effect of the trade war. This is the U.S.-China trade war. And number two, assessing China's trade conduct, especially since its accession to the WTO. And this has some bearing to think about how future U.S. administrations might alter its approach to China. And number three, to speculate on the future of the bilateral economic relationship. First, as a review of the trade war, everyone knows this very well, at least qualitatively, that since early 2018, Trump administration has waged essentially a sequence of battles, progressively raising tariff on ever widening set of goods from China, and China retaliated on a narrower set of goods, but almost always on the same day when US raised the tariff. So much so that by now, the US tariff on Chinese imports are roughly at the level of Smoot-Hawley tariff level 1930s. That's quite amazing. That we used to think that Smoot-Hawley tariff was a thing of the past, but in the last few years, U.S. has essentially revived Smoot-Hawley tariffs when it comes to imports from China. So here's a picture of a Smoot-Hawley, two Republican members of Congress who in the 1930s proposed to raise U.S. tariff on imports very dramatically, and many economic historians attribute it to the think that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was part of the reason for world economy to go into great recession. When there's a change of government in the U.S., a Democratic president came in to power of FDR. These two members of Congress also lost their election, and FDR essentially started a wave of liberalization, starting with the reciprocal trade agreements. So therefore, at this moment, with a new administration coming online in the US, one might also ask, at least speculate, whether there will be a change of a direction, like the end of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Now, just a note on the legality of the U.S. tariff war. In May 2019, China brought a case to the WTO, against the U.S. Tariff, and in September this year, WTO dispute panel formally ruled against the U.S. According to WTO, these U.S. tariffs are inconsistent with U.S. GATT WTO obligations under Articles 1 and 2. And of course, this is not the end of the WTO process, as we know that WTO's appellate body has been made not working by the US, so the process cannot be completed in a technical sense. Separately, even if President-elect Biden disagree with the tariff, if President Biden was the president in 2016, he might not have started the tariff war the way President Trump did. But given that the tariffs are already in place, there's a separate question about whether he would remove those tariffs and at what speed, in what way. So these are the things that's worth thinking. So I thought I would start with a discussion on assessment of the impact of trade war on China, on United States, and on the rest of the world, before moving on to speculating on how President Biden might approach the subject differently. starting with the effect of a trade war on China. There's actually relatively few rigorous studies on this. So I thought I would start with an anecdote. So sometime last year, I was doing an entrepreneurship study in southern China. Trade war has already begun. So I remember asking one entrepreneur, this is in Guangdong, how he was doing and what kind of things worry him these days. That's the kind of question I like to ask every entrepreneur, every firms I visit. What are the things that bothers you? And this entrepreneur's answer surprised me initially. He said, I'm really worried that the trade war will end too soon. The trade war will end too soon. So I was surprised. What do you mean by that? Well, it turns out this person was in the business of exporting jeans to Europe. And he thought, in his judgment and in his observation, that the trade war has made Chinese currency a bit less expensive vis-a-vis euro, and that's helpful to his business. And he worried that the end of the trade war will be accompanied by a rise in the value of a yuan, RMB, and which he think will be bad for his business. Now, of course, it turns out that his view is not universally shared. When I talk to more entrepreneurs, it is clear to me that most entrepreneurs think trade war is terrible for their business, even if their business is not about exporting to the U.S. Firms exporting to U.S. directly are a relatively small part of all the firms in China, but almost all firms are affected by the increased uncertainty associated with the trade war. But the Guangdong business people's the story also reminds us that the impact of the trade war is very different, very heterogeneous across firms and potentially across regions. Nonetheless, overall effect is very negative when one talks to enough entrepreneurs, business people. The overall effect, of course, is it also depends in part on how Chinese government reacts to the trade war. In recent months, the government has talked about dual circulation strategy, partly as a way to deal with the risk of current and future trade war. The idea of a dual circulation strategy is to pay more attention to the potential of the domestic market, pay more attention to the potential of domestic innovation. Here is a guess of what the trade war will do to Chinese economy, made by Euro monitors in 2018, March 2018. At the time, certainly the person doing the projection, Mr. Solomon, didn't anticipate the pandemic, but he did believe, so on this graph, let's just take a look at the graph on the upper left. The blue line shows the projected growth rate in the absence of a trade war, and the purple line shows what will happen to GDP growth rate in China if there's a trade war. So he was projecting a very sharp decline and some recover in the growth rate, but not in terms of level, never recovers to what GDP would have been in the absence of a trade war. So it turns out, this is back in early 2018. It turns out the subsequent U.S. tariff increases were even more dramatic than what happened in March 2018. So he probably was underestimating the strength or the aggressiveness of the trade war. On the other hand, he was also not taking into account potential responsiveness or the strength of the response from Chinese government. But direction-wise, it's clear that trade war is a big negative for China, but the severity of this is somewhat limited by the policy response. In terms of effects on the U.S. economy, there's more studies and more studies by very credible economists that we can look into a number of questions: who pays for the tariff, effects of the tariff war on prices in the U.S., on jobs, on firms, and some political economy discussions. Which part of the country appears to to be affected most by the trade war. So I'm going to just review very quickly a few recent research papers on the subject by very credible economists. By credible economists, I mean economists associated with leading universities in the U.S., National Bureau of Economic Research, or Federal Reserve Banks, and those leading research places. So the first rigorous study on the subject is by Mary Amiti, Steve Redding, and David Weinstein. Mary Amiti is an economist at the New York Federal Reserve. Redding is a professor at Princeton, and Weinstein is my colleague at Columbia University. To look at the effect of a trade war on prices in the U.S. In particular. And in 2018 alone, there were 6 waves of U.S. Tariff war, together with a few counterattacks, to use military term, or retaliatory tariffs by China. So their results can be summarized by the following graph. So remember, there are 6 waves of those tariff increases in 2018. On this graph on the right, there are 7 lines, and the point 0, if you can see maybe if you can see my cursor, the 0 refers to the date on which new wave of tariffs were imposed, and the solid black line are description about what happened to prices for those goods that are not affected by the tariffs. So these can be goods that are not on President Trump's list, or goods coming from other countries whose exports to the U.S. were not affected. And what you essentially see is a flat line, so that unaffected goods do not show an increase in prices, and that's not surprising because U.S. inflation is relatively low throughout this period. Then the 6 other lines in color represents prices of goods affected by different waves of tariff wars. So, for example, this color, essentially, for all 6 waves of tariff, you see relatively clearly evidence of an increase in prices as soon as tariffs were imposed. So, in fact, there's a very big jump in prices, and the jump in prices happened very quickly. Moreover, so therefore, tariff wars clearly have raised prices in the U.S., potentially depressing real income of households. Moreover, you can also look at the magnitude of increase. You can do a econometric analysis of the magnitude or the size of the increase. And I'm skipping the regression table here. But those econometric analysis suggest that the increase in prices is almost one for one relative to the size of the increase of a tariff. So something like for every 10% increase in tariffs, you get close to 9.6, 9.7% of increase in the imported price of the goods. This is interesting because on ex ante basis, or in terms of logic, when US raise tariff, it's not obvious who bears the burden of the tariff. So President Trump likes to suggest that the tariff is paid by the Chinese. What he said, what he meant was, in principle at least, Chinese exporters in response to higher US tariff may choose to cut down their own prices to accommodate the tariff. Right? So therefore, the higher tariff can, in principle, be partly borne by US importers and eventually by US consumers, and partly borne by foreign exporters, in this case, Chinese exporters. But the data suggests that at least these first 6 waves of tariff increase, overwhelming majority of the burden of the higher tariffs were borne by US importers and therefore eventually by US firms and US households. Similarly, on this graph, this shows the volume of US imports from China, and very clearly for each of the 6 waves, as soon as the tariff was imposed, there's a decline in Chinese exports to US for those affected goods, whereas unaffected goods
essentially the export growth was not affected. So this declining volume means, of course, the Chinese exporters also suffer. So even though they didn't seem to cut down their export prices very much, the volume of exports clearly suffered with the rising cost of tariff. First of all, U.S. demand for goods from China probably has declined. Secondly, just not as attractive for Chinese firms to focus on U.S. Market. So in that sense, the tariff war clearly have hurt people on the both sides. Chinese exporting firms seeing a very sharp decline in volume of exports to the U.S. market for those affected goods. U.S. importer firms have to pay high prices, almost 1-for-1. In response to tariff increases. You can convert those numbers into calculation of welfare loss, so-called deadweight losses in the U.S. And clearly, U.S. is bearing a cost of that. There's some additional complication, subtleties about reduction in the varieties available to the U.S. consumers. So some of the goods, Chinese exports get completely shut out from the tariff. Once U.S. raise first 10%, then 25%. By the time you raise tariffs to 25%, a subset of the goods becomes completely uncompetitive. So they just leave the U.S. market. Of course, those producers suffer, but U.S. consumers also suffer by now facing less varieties that are not always substitutable by exporters from other countries. Producers in the U.S. also see an increase in their prices because many of the Chinese exports to the U.S., roughly 40% of Chinese exports to the U.S. are parts and components and other intermediate goods going to U.S. manufacturing sectors and service sectors. And there's a higher tariff also means that U.S. firms on the downstream side are now facing higher tariffs and therefore reduce the competitiveness globally. So that's the evidence from Amity, Redding, and Weinstein. The second paper I want to summarize for you is a paper by Alberto Carvalho, Gita Gopinath, Brent Nyman, and Jenny Tang. So here I color-coded the Gita Gopinath in particular, who is a Harvard professor on leave, currently serving as the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. So their study, just to summarize the results very quickly. First, you can see you get a confirmation that U.S. tariff clearly resulted in higher import prices in the U.S. Very, very clear evidence, consistent with the previous paper. Reduction in U.S. import volume from China, and the new information they add is at least in the initial few months, U.S. retailers seems to absorb a big part of the tariff increase. They were reluctant to pass the tariff increase to consumers initially, and so the firms suffer. Of course, eventually we know this cannot be sustained. Eventually, households will suffer as well. So the next paper I will summarize, in fact, points to the effect on the U.S. household side, where the researcher Michael Wall utilizes high frequency, high quality data on U.S. automobile sales, every single brand, every single type in different U.S. markets. And his particular angle to look at how tariff war affects U.S. households is through the auto sales. And in particular, he found that one interesting finding is that the Chinese retaliatory tariffs, so higher increased tariff by China in response to U.S. tariff, seems to translate into very visible decline in U.S. employment and income in certain regions, and mostly through reduced U.S. exports to China. So here's the way he does it. So since he's working with automobile sales, just as adding one more background note, purchases for automobiles by U.S. households reflect households' perceived income level. When they think income increases, you tend to see more auto sales. On the other hand, if households are anticipating economic difficulties, either lose jobs or expect to lose jobs, they tend to cut down purchases of durable goods like automobiles. So that's the background information. On this graph, what I'm illustrating is that Michael was a way to decomposing the entire United States into many counties. So he has data on county level automobile sales. For each county, you can compute two things. You can compute each county's exposure to President Trump's increase in US tariff. How do you do that? Because different county people are working in different industries. So the occupation composition or sector composition of a local employment tells you how much local region is exposed to US tariff, right? So if you have more people working in a sector where US have raised more tariff, that region will have more exposure to US tariff increase. Similarly, you can also compute each region's exposure to Chinese retaliatory tariffs. These are the, similarly, you also look at the essentially sectoral composition of the employment. So, for example, regions where you have a lot of people working in those US sectors that do a lot of exports to China, that region will be defined as very exposed to Chinese retaliatory tariffs. So these different colors on this graph shows different regions have very different exposure to Chinese tariffs. Dark red area means a lot of exposure, whereas light areas, not much exposure. Dark blue area means very, very little exposure. So the key finding can be summarized by this graph, which is that regions with more exposure to Chinese retaliatory tariff relative to regions not so much exposed show very sharp decline in sales of automobiles as soon as Chinese retaliatory tariff is imposed. So on this graph, this line is where my cursor is March, June 2018 was the time when Chinese retaliatory tariff was imposed. So before Chinese retaliatory tariff, there's basically no difference in auto sales between more or less exposed regions. As soon as Chinese tariff was imposed, regions with whose industries are such that they are more exposed to Chinese tariff see very big decline in sales of automobiles, meaning households in those regions must felt some decline in their income, in their job, either job right away or job prospects. So they cut down purchases of automobiles. And you have regression results to confirm this, which I'm going to skip now. Additional data that look at the mechanisms of this. And indeed, you can see that the region that experience bigger decline in auto sales are regions that tend to have industry that used to export a lot to China. Once the trade war started, these regions see a very big decline in their exports to China. And because China is such a large and previously fast-growing market, the decline of U.S. exports to China cannot be completely offset by finding a different market, by exporting to a different market. So these regions tend to see an absolute decline in their sales, in their exports, and in their income. Table on this slide confirms that regions that are more exposed to Chinese retaliatory tariff tend to see a decline in total employment, and the decline in employment especially concentrated in manufacturing sectors. So in contrast, Michael Wall finds no evidence that U.S. own tariff has helped American households in terms of higher income, more jobs. But the retaliatory tariff from China seems to have a very visible impact in household income and therefore in household consumption. I'm going to skip the third paper due to the time constraint. Or maybe I should just mention one thing. So the third paper is by four authors, including here I use red color to denote Penny Goldberg, a Yale economics professor until last year was World Bank chief economist. So they have a few analysis confirming the previous paper's findings, which I'm going to skip. But I just want to highlight this particular result. In this on this particular graph, they rank all the different regions of the U.S. in terms of the share of the 2016 election for Republicans. So the Republicans' share in 2016 votes. This essentially means the higher the Republican shares, the more likely the local area was pro-Republican. So what this graph shows is, if you look at how different regions were affected by Trump's own tariff increase, you find that you find this this sort of inverse U shape, meaning that the region that has Republican votes not too low, not too high in the middle, seems to be most affected by President Trump's tariff increase. Perhaps President Trump was intentionally designing the tariff increase in a way that trying to affect the so-called swing votes, or swing vote states, or swing vote regions. In comparison, this graph, the upward sloping broken line graph, traces out how different regions were affected by Chinese retaliatory tariff and retaliatory tariff from other trading partners as well, but Chinese tariff in particular. And there, what you'll find is the more Republican votes a region gets, the more likely it tends to be negatively affected by foreign retaliatory tariffs. This is just a fact. This is a graph, is a description of facts. But one might wonder whether, if the foreign tariff were designed differently to also affect those swing votes, perhaps we might get even different. President Trump may even lose more votes in the 2020 election. But because the way foreign tariffs were designed, regions that have very strong Republican support were hurt the most. But these regions probably would have voted for Republicans anyway. So this is sort of the political economy picture of this trade war. I'm going to skip this. I want to go straight to maybe I say one minute on the effect on other countries. Effect on the countries are somewhat more complex. In the short run, when the trade war was waging, one might imagine some of the so-called third parties, other countries, might feel like they have received a favorable trade diversion. That is, when U.S. and China were fighting a war with each other, in terms of tariff increases, other countries, so Vietnam, India, Mexico, might benefit by being able to export more to the U.S. And other high-income countries, potentially Japan, Germany, others, might benefit from being able to export more to the Chinese market, displacing U.S. exports. That's one possible picture. You can tell me whether how much that has happened to Japanese exporting firms. On the other hand, there's also an unfavorable effect for other countries as well. So as soon as U.S. China reached the phase 1 agreement, World Bank research team led by Caroline Freud suggested the phase 1 agreement, but because U.S. has imposed a very high numerical import target for China has to buy huge quantity of various kind of stuff from the U.S. way above the peak purchase China used to have. That kind of agreement, almost by necessity, will imply trade diversion. That in order for China to fulfill this pledge agreement, China would have to buy less from other countries, buy less from some other commodity producing countries in terms of commodity agreement, buy less advanced manufacturing products from Japan, from Europe in terms of advanced manufacturing agreement. So there's also a clear negative trade diversion coming from this phase 1 trade agreement. Yet we don't really hear that many complaints from other countries. Most countries are reluctant to criticize, to antagonize Trump administration. but the trade diversion is real. The other less visible, potential side effect and very negative side effect is that the trade war also seems to normalize the weaponization of a tariff. It seems to show that it's okay to use tariff to achieve non-commercial goals, and that's potentially very negative for the world. Correlated to this is the trade war also comes at a time where the way WTO functions is severely undermined by the dispute settlement process. For example, even when WTO rule against the U.S. tariff, such case will go nowhere, since WTO process in this case is not going to be very effective. So that's just one short comment on the effect on other countries. So I think therefore the overall effect of a trade war on China, on US, and on the rest of the world is a lose situation. I didn't say anything about technology war. I think assessing technology war is more complex, and we don't see that many rigorous studies yet. In principle, the technology war can be motivated by a combination of some genuine national security concern and some desire to help domestic technology firms, but disguised in the form of a national security. The relative weight of the two is hard to say, and someday there will be a study that we're trying to estimate of the two, but I think the assessment probably still, a rigorous assessment still needs to be done. I want to, in the last few minutes, just speculate on President-elect Biden's potential approach to China. So we have a new president in waiting in the U.S., and which means there's a reset opportunity for the bilateral relationship. So naturally, one needs to ask oneself, what does U.S. really want? What does Biden and his team really want from China? What kind of reforms they want to see done? What they also would want to know, is China capable of doing those pro-efficiency reforms, rule-based reforms? And finally, are there scopes for collaborations? Of course, list of structural reforms that one wants to see done in China is not secret. There are many things you want to see. Disciplines on industrial policies, disciplines on subsidies, disciplines on state-owned firms, exchange rate and financial sector reforms, greater protection of intellectual property rights, further reduction in trade and investment barriers, and potentially a more balanced growth models. Would China, is it realistic to expect to see progress on China? That's something that one should know. If you look at the current U.S. administration's rhetoric, they basically are saying, since you have not seen any progress by China in the last 20 years, why should you expect to see any progress in the next 4 years? So I thought it'd be useful to just review some of the basic facts, so that there can be a basis for thinking about whether a potentially different Biden approach has any chance of success or not. So starting with trade barriers and trade balance of China. So let's just recall some very simple fact. On this in this picture, I present two sets of data. So one is, if you look at all the gray dots, these gray dots, each gray dot is one country. So I'm looking at trade barriers, essentially weighted average of applied tariff by a country in 2017 compared to that country's income level as measured by GDP per capita in logarithmic form. The gray dots show demonstrate a relatively strong negative association between the two. meaning on balance, richer countries have lower tariffs, poorer countries have higher tariffs. That's probably not surprising to any people here, but the data confirms that pattern. That is, poorer countries do tend to have higher tariffs. Now the red triangles tracks Chinese tariffs from 1992 to more recent years. So every triangle represents one particular Chinese tariff in particular year. So the one on the far left is Chinese tariff in 1992, average across all products, and 1993, 1994, and so on. So what you see is very big decline, perhaps not surprising to people in reality who work on this, or people who in the government who work on negotiating with the Chinese. China used to be an extremely inward-looking country, like North Korea today, essentially. Like, that's not surprising to you, and that's partly reflected in very, very high tariffs. But then, throughout the 1990s and all the way to early 2000s, you see very dramatic decline in tariff. So this is essentially 2001. By the time China joined WTO, Chinese tariff becomes roughly comparable to other countries at similar income level. And then as income continue to increase, you see progressive further decline in tariff. So this tells us perhaps three things, right? So so this is sort of a factual description of a trade barriers, and you can look at this. So Chinese tariff today is somewhere here on the order of 8% on average. There are three views. One is look at the Chinese tariff today compared to U.S. tariff, compared to Japanese tariff outside the agriculture sector. You say, well, Chinese tariff is very high, twice as high, more than twice as high as the U.S. Tariff before the U.S. Trade war. U.S. trade war has managed to raise the tariff substantially, but before the trade war, you said, China clearly has much higher tariff than U.S. Therefore, you should reform more. So that statement is, clearly technically true, that Chinese tariff is higher than U.S. and higher than most high-income countries. Therefore, more scope for reforms. That's one way, one takeaway. The other takeaway is that across the world, average tariff level tends to be a function of income. And when compare China to other countries at comparable income, the tariff level or level of trade protection is roughly what you would expect for a country at that level of income. So China is, in other words, is not particularly protectionist. And that's probably not surprising to any Japanese firm that are doing trade as well. So if you don't compare Chinese market with U.S. market, but you compare Chinese market with Indian market, Pakistan market, Indonesia market, one will realize that the trade barriers, Chinese trade barriers, are no high. In fact, on many dimensions, Chinese markets tends to be more open than the Indian market. And the third takeaway, of course, compared to Chinese own past, you see very rapid reduction in barriers. And that's also not surprising. In a way, that's why Chinese growth rate has been so high. So China didn't grow because it chose to protect itself. Rather, China grew because it chose to liberalize, engaging in many pro-efficiency reforms, right? So Chinese growth example is not a counterexample to textbook economics message. Rather, that it's a confirmation of the message that market is important, getting incentive, right is important, getting efficient allocation of resources is right. Therefore, this was suggests that China is entirely capable of doing pro-market, pro-efficiency reforms, and that would there will be something important for Biden team to take into account. I'm going to skip this. Maybe I just want to quickly say so for people in the U.S. who worry about Chinese trade imbalance. President Trump's Commerce Department just last week announced a new anti-subsidy case against the Chinese exporting firm, not based on any actual subsidy they discover, but under the ground that Chinese exchange rate was substantially undervalued, and that exchange rate undervaluation was equivalent to subsidy, and that's potentially set a very dangerous precedent in judging a subsidy. At the time, this is a time where IMF and essentially no economists think Chinese exchange rate is substantially undervalued. And on this picture, we show Chinese trading balance. There was trade surplus peaked around 2007, 2008, and then declined very steadily to now, on a multilateral basis, approximately zero. So Chinese trade surplus essentially is negligible compared to certainly to Germany, to Singapore, to many other countries. Even so, there are very thorny issues about protection of intellectual property. That there's a discussion about whether this is so. If one's only source of information is based on speeches by U.S. congressmen, senators, and so on, you will think the intellectual property rights protection is getting worse and worse in China, and that's actually much harder subject to study, because I was thinking, how does one actually get objective data on intellectual property rights? Have some measure about the level of intellectual property rights protection. If you talk to lawyers, because lawyers are in the business of complaining about violation cases. If you ask U.S. companies, do you have intellectual property rights? Do you encounter intellectual property rights violation? They say yes. If you ask which country give you most those cases, the answer is other U.S. companies. U.S. companies mostly deal with other U.S. companies, and most of the acquisition of IP violation by U.S. companies tends to be about other U.S. companies. But internationally, of course, there's a lot of complaint about China. So in other words, the lawyers' complaint is somewhat needs to be qualified a little bit. So I came upon with the following idea. In balance of payment data, you can get data on a country's payment, royalty payment, IP, copyright, and other user fee payment to foreign patent holders and foreign IP holders. So these are payment by firms from one country to foreign IP rights holders. These very well recorded in balance of payment data and can be cross-checked by partner countries' data. And that so if you look at IP payment to foreign right holders, on a per capita basis, that's actually is a one quantitative measure about a country's IP regime. So on this picture, I plot for all countries in the IMF database, I plot per capita payment to foreign IP rights holders in 2017 against that country's income level in 2017. And you see a very strong positive association between the two. That is, on average, richer countries tend to pay more to foreign rights, IP rights holders. That shouldn't be surprising. On the one hand, richer countries' economy is more IP intensive. They use more IPs. On the other hand, they also probably have stronger IP protection regime, and they will pay more to foreign right holders. So each dot represents one country. I collect data for all countries except China. Now I'm going to impose Chinese information to this graph. I'm going to so what I'm doing here now, all the red triangles are Chinese per capita payment to foreign patent and IP rights holders from 1997 all the way to 2017. What you see are two things. One is Chinese payment, license fee, and other IP fee payment to foreign rights holders is roughly what you would expect from Chinese income level. It's lower in 1996, 97, 98, and then rises slightly above the international norm defined based on income, and rises as Chinese income rises. In other words, the available objective data. So you can read this graph in two ways. One is Chinese IP regime. seems to be weaker than high-income country. Chinese IP fee payment is not as high as Japan, US, typical European countries. So there's more, more progress to make. On the other hand, progress has been made over time, and progress has been made more or less in line with Chinese income growth. That actually also is something useful to keep in mind when we think about negotiation with China in strengthening IP protection. I think the logic behind this evidence of improvement in IP regime is actually very clear. As Chinese local innovation has been progressing over time, here's a picture that shows Chinese R&D as a share of GDP has been rising very, very fast. There's more local intellectual property rights to protect. Therefore, there's a lot of local demand for ever strengthening IP regime as well. So therefore, IP protection is not a hopeless thing for other countries to negotiate. In fact, there's a good reason to think that China is on a path of strengthening IP protection. I'm going to probably skip the picture about the WTO discussion, given that I'm short of time. The key takeaway is that if you want to, another thing we worry about is whether WTO provides sufficient discipline, sufficient rules to on the conduct of the Chinese trade policy and trade practices. If you only listen to U.S. sort of information campaign by Commerce Department or trade representative, you will think that China violates WTO rules left and right, and WTO's rules are insufficient to constrain Chinese behavior. But if you look at data, so WTO actually on its website releases all the data on one trading partner's complaint about another trading partner's. So here are three evidence. Let me just summarize very quickly for you. One is if you look at complaints by other WTO countries about the trade behavior of China, Chinese firms or Chinese trade policies, you find the complaints roughly about 12.6% of the total complaints. That's roughly comparable to Chinese share of exports in global exports. In other words, the complaint in fact is roughly proportional to volume. Moreover, there are fewer complaints against Chinese exporting practices than complaints about the US. There are 99 cases against US since 2001 compared to 44 cases against the Chinese exporting firms. And there are 52 cases against EU, which is also more than complaint against China. So in other words, the data from WTO does not support the idea that China stands out as a country whose behavior has been complained more by other WTO members. Now, what about on the other side? Does China complain a lot about other countries' behavior to overwhelm the WTO process? And the WTO data also suggests that's not the case. That China, in fact, is much less, China less likely to be complained than its import share would suggest. Finally, in terms of compliance with WTO rulings, virtually all large countries do not have a perfect record. So China does not have a perfect record. US does not have a perfect record. If you use, how often does other country, if a country win a case against China or against the US, if that country will find it necessary to go back to WTO for the second time, a third time, there might be an indication that the country that lost the case didn't quite do what WTO says. If you use that as a indicator of non-compliance, data suggests that there seems to be more non-compliance cases by US than by China. So among all cases that China has lost, only twice the other country need to go back to WTO to secure additional ruling, compared to 15 times when US lost the case, other country would have to go back to WTO to argue for another case. The summary of this is that in terms of compliance with global trading rules, China is also not a hopeless case. Data does not support the information campaign that China is a hopeless case. I'm going to skip perhaps this discussion about whether Biden should view China as another Soviet Union or another Athens or another Japan in 1990s. Probably will go to this picture. Given our friends in Tokyo. So this picture shows evolution of different countries' share in global GDP after 1960, something that should be familiar to all of us, but some data to just remind us. We know US has been #1 economy for more than 100 years. It's not just US has been #1 economy for multiple generations, but the difference or the gap between US as #1 and some other countries #2, the gap is very, very large. So there's very few countries was ever in sight of ever catching up with the US. Right after World War II, there are altogether 3 countries, that once occupied #2 position. In the first few 20, 30 years, it was Soviet Union, and Soviet Union clearly was regarded as a enemy of the US. And then from mid-70s to early 2000s, you know this better than I do, that Japan was #2 economy, a very clear #2 economy in the world. The thing I want to note was that the difference between Japanese economy and US economy was minimized around the 1990s. Essentially, starting from late 1980s, it's very clear that Japanese economy was doing very well. Japanese firms were doing very well, and it caused a psychological shock in the US. And there's also a few books, both from Japan and from the US, that also generate the alarm in the US. And you know this better than I do, that there were a lot of negative media reports in the US about Japanese economy, conduct of Japanese trade policy, conduct of Japanese companies. As Chinese economy overtook Japan from 2006 onwards, reports about Japanese economy, dissipated very quickly in the U.S. media, and there's a lot more negative reports about China. I'm not suggesting that's the reason or the only reason or one of the major reasons. I'm just suggesting that there's an intriguing pattern in the data that might suggest that a part of the reason for so much negative reports about trade conduct of China might be related to a picture like this. And of course, potentially China is much more threatening than Japan. Given the much bigger population size, China is on course to in fact surpass the size of the U.S. economy, perhaps within 1 generation, and can be twice as large as U.S. economy within 2 generations. And that is that will be very unfamiliar to people here, and that might motivate some of the policy discussions. President Biden has a chance to reset this. Should he reset this? Well, if so, how he will do it? I just want to quickly say perhaps 3 things. One is given President Trump's tariff, even if this is not something that President Biden will start, since tariffs are already in place, you don't want to just necessarily give up that very quickly. So President Biden's team may very well trying to leverage tariff in place in a way to extract reforms, extract the policy changes from China. That's one point. The other point I want to make is, President Biden's team very likely will focus more on structural reforms in China and less on numerical targets. And the last thing I want to perhaps comment, given that President-elect Biden has said that climate change is a priority for him, and maybe his team will be looking into converting China tariff focusing on imports from China, to carbon tariff, use of a tariff for the greater good of a climate change management. So maybe I just make this to be the last last comment on the carbon tariff. So first, let me add the background information. Of course, climate change arguably is one of the most serious existential threats to the survival of human race. 2015 Paris Climate Accord was a significant achievement, but it was still an insufficient achievement in the sense that the Paris Accord simply pushed off the danger point. It didn't quite eliminate the danger point. The world, relative to a business as usual path of greenhouse gas emission, 2015 Paris Accord certainly was very useful for the world. But even if every country does what it has promised to do, what it has pledged to do in Paris, the world is still on a path of self-destruction. It simply will happen a little bit later, but it has not got off the track. So at the time, all the climate conscious leaders' hope was that Paris Agreement was a starting point, and then they will move on to get countries to sign new agreements, more ambitious agreements, so that eventually we can move towards a carbon-free world. But the problem with, but the difficulty in negotiating with Paris Agreement shows, tells us that it's not that easy to get country to pledge more if they couldn't pledge. If they find the trouble to pledge enough in Paris, right? President Trump's withdrawal from Paris Agreement, of course, deals the global effort at climate change a new blow. It's a major negative in two ways. One is it provides some cover to those countries that don't want to do much, even under Paris Agreement. Now they can do it without much pushback. The other is it makes it impossible for another round of global negotiation during President Trump's time, because without US participation, it's not very meaningful, and it's probably not very feasible anyway. So China's recent pledge to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 is actually an interesting development. It goes beyond China's pledge in Paris. Since it happens to also coincide with President-elect Biden's interest in reviving global climate negotiation, perhaps under the leadership of the US, this provides an interesting area of collaboration between the two and with other countries as well. I want to suggest that I mentioned carbon tariff because I think there are a few fatal flaws with the 2015 Paris Agreement. It's not very sufficient, not very ambitious, I already mentioned this, and it has no enforcement power, that they rely on individual countries voluntarily do what they say they will do. But if a country fails to deliver what they do, the rest of the world have not much power to do something about it. It also very importantly ignores what economists will call a general equilibrium effect. That is, if only a subset of countries, let's say Japan, let's say Europe, agree to phase out, say, coal-powered plants. Not all high-income countries have agreed to do that yet, but let's assume they agree to phase out coal-powered plants. This is actually, this will make everyone in the country feel good about themselves, but this will not be enough. In fact, when Europe and Japan choose not to do certain carbon-intensive power plants, it will make price of coal much cheaper than otherwise, which in fact paradoxically offers greater incentives for other countries to use coal to generate power, because it becomes even a cheaper source of fuel than otherwise the case. That's what I mean by general equilibrium effect that's being ignored by the Paris Agreement. It also ignores what I call the next China problem. China so far is the largest emitter in terms of flow. China is not the largest emitter in terms of stock. China is not the largest emitter in terms of per capita calculation. U.S. has twice as high emission on per capita basis than China, but China nonetheless, in terms of overall volume emission, is the largest. Therefore, there's so much focus on China. The problem is, there are two problems. One is China itself is transforming. The economic structure and growth model are transforming. It's becoming less carbon intensive just due to structural transformation on its own. Plus, with the new carbon neutrality pledge, China is also moving towards more use of renewable energy and so on. The problem is the world as a whole has not changed the consumption pattern very much. Our overall consumption bundle, when I say our, I mean that includes Americans, Japanese, Europeans. Our consumption bundle is still very carbon intensive, even though those products may no longer be produced in our own country. It has to be produced somewhere. Today, China producing a big chunk of it, but tomorrow, if China is not producing it, India, Indonesia, and many other countries will be producing it, so that just having carbon neutrality in Japan, in Europe, even China and US will not be enough. Other countries essentially will become the next China in terms of the leading producer of those carbon intensive products. In other words, we need to move to a regime where every country will find it expensive to do carbon intensive production, and every consumers anywhere in the world will find it expensive to consuming carbon intensive products. President Biden might very well want to do this. Given China's pledge, perhaps China will be online as well. And of course, we want to know, whether we can hold China to its promise. We want to make sure that it will be expensive for China to reverse that pledge. And one way to do this, I want to suggest, is to have a carbon tariff, which is to rather than using tariff as a protectionist tool, but let's use tariff on carbon incentive products as a means to raise the cost of producing carbon intensive products, as a way to raise the cost of consuming carbon intensive products. So they will fundamentally alter producers' incentive to engage in carbon intensive production, not just in China, Japan, or US, but everywhere in the world. Now, of course, this carbon tariff needs to be complemented by other policies, and I will suggest technical support to developing countries, including the carbon tariff does not just mean moving away entirely from renewable energy, completely away from fossil fuel energy. You can also have technologies, low-cost technology to capture carbon and store carbon. Currently, those technologies are available but very expensive. So we need to have essentially global industrial policies to incentivize innovation to lower those costs. And this has to be part of the complements. And most developing countries probably do not have the technical capacity to do that, and we need to provide technical support for that. For very, very poor countries, moving to a carbon-free world might imply some adjustment difficulties, and we therefore need to also offer financial help to those countries. So I think with a combination of Biden administration and the new pledge we just heard from Prime Minister of Japan and President from China and other countries, perhaps the world has a chance to upgrade our ambition so that we might get carbon neutrality from all high-income countries by 2050, most of the middle-income countries by 2060, and the world might have a chance to get carbon neutrality by 2075. If this is still not easy and not guaranteed, and carbon tariff will be a useful input into this. So that's what I want to say about the potential collaboration between U.S., China, and between these countries and the rest of the world. Okay, to summarize, trade war has created a lose, lose, and lose situation for China, for the United States, and for the rest of the world. Number one. Number two, the record of China in terms of reducing trade barriers, investment barriers, in terms of intellectual property rights protection seems to be quite different from typical media reports and from very strongly negative US rhetoric. In fact, it shows that China is capable of doing genuine pro-market reforms, in doing global rules reforms. So that provides a foundation for productive negotiations between the two parties and at the global level. And number three, future relationship between the two countries perhaps need to focus more on structural reforms in China and less on numerical import targets. And finally, with the new administration in the US and with the recent carbon neutrality pledge from China, joint work between the two and work with the global community towards a carbon-free world before the end of this century now holds new promise. Thank you very much.